Today we are looking at Thieves of the Tome by George Philbrick, which is the 50th RPG Book Club winner. The creator also posted an actual play to the subreddit that I'm definitely going to take a look at later, but I've heard that people appreciate being to see something a bit closer of a first look at the rulebook better, so I'm not going to be looking at that until after I've recorded this, just so people have a chance to see what I gather about the game from the rulebook itself. Though I have taken a look at some of this before. There's some credit to various people. Let me see. Yeah, a lot of it was created using public domain artwork. Now, looking at the table of contents, and I've already looked at this a little, we start out with the basics, and then all of this stuff, which to, my eye at first glance, all seems like it's more lore and setting related. And I would expect a description of the game to come first, or the mechanics, or the purpose of this and all of that. But if you actually scroll down, it does start, with an overall description of the game. It's just that is not explicitly included as a category in the table of contents, which I think it should be, but, probably isn't a huge deal. So, just imagine for a second there's sort of an introduction to the game portion right there, and then it goes to things which all seem like they're about the setting in a bit more detail. We get to Chapter 1, which is labeled The Beginning, which is not a super informative title, but I can guess what it is pretty easily, and for this portion of the book, it doesn't really matter. Tome, session overview. Effectively, that all seems to make sense for that section. Now this, I believe, is about sort of the spell-making aspect of the system, which is the main focus, or at least the main unique mechanic, and it relies on actual real-world physical books, unless I'm mistaken, which is very interesting. Yep, and there's a lot of titles here, but it takes place over only about 6 or 7 pages. So it may seem like a lot looking at this, but if you look closer, it's pretty good. What I mean by that is, if each of these headings had a full page dedicated to them, I'd say that might be a little too much dedicated to just the spell mechanic, but it's actually only 4 or 5 pages, let's say, or, well, maybe 6, but it's not as much information as it appears just by looking at the listings, if you ignore the page numbers. So I think this is fine. Okay, this is, a lot of stuff around character creation. Yeah, pretty much just character creation. Then we get into the actual gameplay. I guess how that plays out in session rather than just, the setup and how you would cast a spell, actually doing all of those things. There's casting spells there. And there isn't really an explicit casting a spell thing here, even though it talks a lot about spells. So this is more what actually happens in a session and how you play the game. Okay, on embodying Nazar, which, is not really covered in the demo, it looks like, which is fine, but you've got an overview of the game and the setting, then discussing sort of the terms, and I guess all the stuff that'll appear in here, like session overview is really more section 4, but a lot of what you'll find in this book in a more summarized way, I'm guessing. Then you go into making spells, making characters, actually playing in a session. And that seems like a logical order, but we'll have to see how that goes when we actually start getting into the book. Alright. Thieves of the Tome is a role-playing game meant to be played in 1 or 2 short sessions. Very important to have that early on. It is about incompetent thieves stealing unlimited magic potential from highly competent mages and not knowing what to do with it. It is an acid punk love letter to books. I don't really know what acid punk means. I gave feedback on this before and got a better explanation of that, but it looks like all the comments on that post have been removed, so I can't actually go back and see what acid punk meant, but based on, this image and this cover, I feel like I sort of have an idea. This game provides a way to dive into your favorite books, steal magic from evil people, and come out the other side laughing and triumphant. Yeah, it probably also provides an opportunity to fail at doing that, but I don't know whether or not that is accurate, and even if it is, whether that needs to be included in that introductory portion or not. Yep, 3 to 4 hours, 2 to 6 players. Several 6-sided die. If it's 1 per player, which I'm not sure it is, you could probably say that there, but I don't know if that's accurate. 1 book per player, each with clear sections. Very important, and the thing that someone is least likely to have lying around on hand, so that might need to be bolded or something. And optionally, printed character sheet. Had to stop recording for a minute just to check on something. Now we're back. Right, players will embody thieves who have stolen tomes from the Library of Nazar, or Nazar, something like that. The tomes will be books that other players have brought to the table, which was one of the things I've liked about this, is that you don't write, it's a little complicated, that you're not necessarily interacting with the book you bring, which I think adds a lot of interest to the spellcrafting mechanic, which might be a little too simple otherwise. While thieves can read and understand the names of the spells written in the tomes and attempt to cast them, the exact details of what will happen when a spell is cast are elusive to them. Magic is a fickle thing, and that probably plays into the incompetence idea. The player characters are not competent thieves, though I don't know if that's just in regard to magic casting or other things the thieves might attempt to do. 1 player will be the game master. They will embody Nazar, the first scribe of the tomes and original writer of destiny. They will describe the world, portray characters around the players, and act as the ultimate educator of the game using their book. The number 1 rule to GMing, TOT. When in doubt, read a section from your tome. I don't know what TOT means there. What happens during a session? That is fairly interesting. I'll have to see how that actually plays out later. The thieves will steal their tomes and flee from sorceress despots called the White Guard. The meat of this game occurs when the thieves are forced to use spells that they don't understand to solve problems. Most of the time, this will result in some truly catastrophic chaos. If you have ever desired to be a witch, mage, or sorcerer, then this game is for you. There are a lot of games like that, so I don't know if that's really accurate, You can say that about almost every RPG, and obviously not every RPG where you are a witch, mage, or sorcerer is going to fit people that want to be one. If you have a love of books, then this game is for you. That seems like a more direct connection. If you love to watch a disaster of incompetence unfold and laugh at the consequences, then this game is for you. Again, that seems a little more connected to the things that are unique about the system. If you want to roar through prismatic multidimensional chaos on a chariot of molten glass, then this game is certainly for you. There we go. Nazar, the Great Scrivener. I'm probably not going to read this out loud. I'm just going to skim some of it. Okay, Throne of Opal staring into the alabaster white. Not sure what that is yet. And as they stared, their vision blurred until blackness folded over emptiness, and in between the two swimming colors formed in between blankness folded over emptiness, and in between blankness and emptiness, the two swimming colors formed. What two swimming colors? Maybe that will be revealed later. Nazar's eyes filled with images of dripping primordial dreams, and their head swelled with fantasia. And that definitely seems more acid core, though I don't entirely know what that is yet. Right, from all that, the great Scrivener wrote the first tome, the first story. It wasn't a good story, in fact. You or I might call it derivative or dull. It does seem how it would possibly be derivative if it's really the first story. But maybe this is just the first magical story, or they're just saying it would seem derivative to people who have read all other stories and did not know that it was the first story ever made. But most importantly, it was a tome, a container of an entire world created by Nazar. They were proud of it, and it made them feel much better to have an empty mind. Yeah, so they keep doing that. Wrote tragedies, plays, field guides, brochures, and craft books, all containing worlds upon worlds. At this point, the alabaster white they were staring at receded, and the pressure on Nazar's mind grew less. Right, so that is... Let's see if I can even tell what the number is. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe quadrillion, but I don't know if that's accurate. Because that's like... Maybe it's 8 billion. I can't remember how billion and trillion and stuff work. But that's possibly 8 billion, 888 million, 888,888 tomes. I'm not sure what the significance of that number is yet. Right. After doing that, he relaxed, or they relaxed, I guess. It seems to be gender neutral at this point for Nazar. They had scribed the tomes and brought forth all tomalities, and they were no longer tormented with visions and sleeps in the center of them, surrounded by the true tomes. Whoops, didn't want to do that yet. Each tome contains a world. Stuff like the world of the Lord of the Rings, or the world of the Lord of the Rings, whatever that's called, exists somewhere in this multiverse of books. And so it looks like, I don't know if this is accurate, but you could consider, based on some of the stuff he wrote later in this paragraph, our world to be one of the tomalities. And in our world, there are books reflective of other tomalities, but they are sort of just inspired by those worlds. And then there is a separate book that originally created that tomality. So that's a little confusing maybe, but I don't think it really matters. It's kind of supposed to be trippy anyway. Your grandparents' guide to making fabulous handbags contains its own world of twisting sentient yarn, felted fields, and folding fabric rivers. So it definitely doesn't seem the book is one-to-one. But again, every book in our world is either an exact or a false copy of a separate book, which then created a world, and the original book was written by Nazar, even though there was a copy of that book in our world written by someone else, it appears. Now, this part is really confusing. A tome is the 888th printed version of a written work, because now we have 3 variations of books, it looks like. Oh, whoops, sorry. It's annoying that that keeps happening. Because you've got, first Nazar writes a tome, or at least I'm assuming that's what happens first. It could be that he writes a tome, after a book is written. Then, in our world, a book that is a copy of the book that contains the world is written, and yet the 888th printing of said book is also a tome, or is actually the tome. Like, you would think the tome would be what Nazar wrote that created the tonality, but if so, that means that he only writes a tome after it has been written several other times. Well, written once by someone else and then printed. That would mean that, yeah, so, like, in theory, Lord of the Rings is a book that, was channeling a tome that Nazar wrote, and yet the 888th printing of that channeling then becomes the original tome that inspired it, is what it kind of seems like, which is definitely confusing. Right, the libraries of Nazar. Each tomality has a library of Nazar. The tomes are incredibly powerful items and coveted in every world. And the rich and powerful seek them out and inevitably collate them in a library, and yet this library is a library of Nazar and not a library of whatever rich and powerful person is in charge of it in that tomality. And that happens for unknown reasons. And they may control the world through these tomes, but may do so openly or secretly. We'll call them the White Guard. Yeah, I don't know if that's in reference to a real world fact or in any way, or that's just, more reference to the 888th print being a tome. But the bad guys are the White Guard, basically. Eventually, a group of competent people learn about them and decide, hell, I ought to take some of this power for myself, and they're the thieves, and yet the thieves were referred to as incompetent earlier in the text, so it might really be that the incompetency only refers to in matters of magic, but it's hard to say. And the players are the thieves. Something I forgot to comment on is that there is a lot of I in this narration, and it's not really clear what perspective, the narrator has or who the narrator is, whether they're supposed to be fully impartial or not, or whether they're supposed to be the author of this book in full or not. Okay, yep, there we go, there's an image. Seems fitting. Tomes. Now, this is important because you want to know the specifications for the books you gotta bring. Each player, including the GM, needs to bring a real-world book to the table to play. It will be handed to another player, so it is important that the sections are clear to all players. There are no hard requirements for tomes other than they must have at least 6 clearly marked chapters or sections. They may be, and that's bolded, which is good, they may be fiction, non-fiction, brochures, guidebooks, or whatever written text you like. Oftentimes, weirder is better. You do not need to have read a book to bring it to this game. These books represent the in-game tome stolen by the thieves. They serve 3 purposes. Each chapter is a spell. The thief who stole the tome will use the book to cast spell. The words in the tome describes the thief as they are and will be. Excerpts from the stolen tome will be used in character creation. Now that's interesting, because that means that, some elements of character creation are out of your control as well as spell creation. Because, you use a book someone else takes. Yeah, because it's handed to another player at the beginning. And character creation is after spell creation anyway. The words in the tome may overflow. Sometimes players will be asked to read sentences aloud from their tome to influence the world. Definitely fun. Right, session overview. And the setup takes 30 minutes to 1 hour. So each player goes through the book they brought and writes spells for the chapters. And keep that secret. The players hand their spell sheets to the GM. Their book is placed in the center of the table, keeping secret spell effects. Just off the top of my head, part of me thinks it would be more interesting for a player who didn't bring the book to write the spells for it, because their lack of familiarity with the book might make their take on it more wild or interesting. But I think that would also add a lot of complexity with how the other ways the game is going to have to work. Because unless you're passing it, because pretty much any way you did that, it would involve passing it around multiple times if you want the player who actually uses those spells to not know what they are. So that would add complexity, but it might be interesting. Alright, Nazar's introduction. The GM introduces the tonality and the escape condition the thieves must complete to end the game. Definitely going to have to read more about that. Character creation phase. And that also sort of, that it is not the book you bring that you get, is also sort of reflective of the idea of stealing. Though obviously that's not fully what's happening in reality, it's more like borrowing. At the beginning, it starts after they take the tomes. The middle of the players describe how their thieves pursue their destinies, and the escape position. This kind of sounds like more of a group storytelling style than a, game with mechanics and win and failure condition style, but we'll have to see what exactly it's like when we get into the details. Yeah, this is more like that. The GM presents challenges and obstacles, and the players respond in kind by casting spells or acting. At the end, play continues until all thieves die or they achieve their destinies and the escape conditions set out by the GM. Going back to here, spellcraft. I'm going to go back a bit and see how far along we are in the table of contents. We're up to 13. So we've moved on to the beginning. Let me see if that's clear. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I didn't really pay attention to the switch of sections, but there's a whole image to go along with it. Just going back a bit to double check something. Yeah, and it is all more or less about tomes, which is reflected here. The beginning is tomes and such. There is a session overview here, though. Is that marked or did I miss that somehow? Yeah, this is the session overview. That's spellcraft. Chapter section is considered a spell. Each player will write the effects of the spell for the books they brought. They write these in secret. Right, the name of the spell is the section title, or if it does not have one, the first section in that sentence in that section. So each chapter or section of a book is considered a single spell. Might be a little bit inaccurate, though I could be wrong. Because based on this, at least 6 clearly marked chapters or sections. From that, I would assume each player is creating, 6 spells, but it might be that you just need to have 6 at minimum, but you're actually creating a spell for every chapter. I'm going to have to find out how that works, because here it says each chapter is considered a single spell. So if your book has more than 6 chapters, I would assume from this that you're creating more than 6 spells potentially, but we'll see what the answer is. Okay, name, then choice, a statement which prompts the caster to choose something. Typically targets, but can also be more abstract. And it must start with the word choose. So it looks like the text of the chapter is still not really involved. It's just purely the title. A description of what the spell does. Yeah, so it's all coming out from the name. Yeah, and it actually looks like that you can have the choice be, multiple choices rather than just one. Here it's both a target and a natural disaster. Alright, so this is awkward because it's sort of written like this is instructions on how to make a spell, and yet the title is Anatomies of a Spell, which would just be indicative of labeling the different types of a spell, and it also does not specify, like whether you have to do each chapter a section or there's a set number. Because if it's each chapter, for some books, that's going to take a while, and that also has a mechanical effect on how valuable the book is, in theory. Like, if this were written like instructions on how to write a spell, it would be something more like first look at a section of the book and observe the title of that section, then write that title as the name of a spell, rather than being written as the name of the spell is the section or title without really indicating how a section is come upon. Like, I can easily guess from this that you're just going from section to section doing it, but it's not written as instructions telling me how to do that. It's just, it's just sort of talking about what a spell is and then telling you to put it in the center of the table, and you can definitely infer instructions from this, but it's not written as instructions. Yeah, so the book goes in the center of the table, the written spells go to Nazar. Yeah, Nazar definitely has to make sure they do not mix up what spells go to what book. Okay, writing each of the spells for Moby Dick, so it definitely seems like every chapter. Yeah, that was something I wanted to go back for a bit here. Okay. It's just making sure it never implied that the text of the chapter was important for the spell, which it doesn't super seem like it is. Like, I maybe would prefer it that way, but it looks like the text of the books is being involved enough in other ways that it doesn't really matter if the only thing that directly inspires the spells is the name of the chapter. Looks like the themes of the book are supposed to be involved as well, but that doesn't seem as strictly enforced. Right, casting a spell. Let me double check something. We're on 12. So it's kind of funny. There's no section on casting a spell here, and yet they're listed in the table of contents despite there being a casting a spell title in this section, and yet there is one later. That's just kind of funny. Don't think it matters, just worth noting. Okay, the thief speaks the name of the spell. The GM reads the choice statement to the players. Interesting. The thief chooses accordingly. The GM reads the effect to the players. So you definitely, from this, get a solid amount of information on what the spell is going to do before you make the choice. Like, a solid amount of inference to it. I'm not sure there'd be another way to do it, but that's just good to know. You're not, like, going in completely blind. You know, you would say loomings, then the Nazar would say choose a person you can see in a type of natural disaster. The player would then maybe try and guess what the spell does based on that, but then choose a person and a natural disaster, and then that person would be convinced of the occurrence of the natural disaster or its impending occurrence. So that seems like you can guess relatively, at least from this particular spell, what it's going to do. Like something to a person involving a natural disaster. So you can know that's something you probably want to use against a bad guy. So that's good, at least, that you know you're not going in completely blind. It might be a little more wild if you were, but kind of inconvenient as well. Now the thief chooses, the GM reads the effect. Like to go into more detail, you might assume, from the choice that you make a natural disaster happen to someone, though the title should make you guess otherwise, but it's actually, they just become convinced it's going to happen. So there's definitely a little bit of mystery there, at the very least. And the GM and players decide what happens, but the GM has the final call. Oh, whoops. Alright, you put a star over the spell, and it cannot be cast again. Which means some players may be limited to 6 spell casts. Yeah, a combination of the original spell writer's intent, the thief's poorly informed usage of it, and the GM's moderation. Also, sort of the book itself does have some impact, so in a way it's also a dialogue with the author of that book, just in a much more indirect fashion. It can create truly catastrophic failures, where a spell is used at the worst possible time, or create moments of mind-melting elation when the caster correctly infers how the writer intended the spell to be used. I'm really getting annoyed about how sensitive that is. I'm going to have to zoom in a bit, because then I'm not going to be... Maybe just zoom out all the way so I don't bother to do the 2 fingers thing at all. Later in the game, CJ and Maddie's thieves have broken into the Grand Royal Museum. Ah, yes, the Red Robe. No idea what that is. So this is where it's the first sentence instead of the title, because the section did not have a title. Yeah, it explains that. This spell title is the first sentence of Chapter 1, since, you're not just doing Chapter 1 for the spell. The GM finds the spell on the spell sheet and then reads the choice to CJ. Pick something you have worried about. So just based on the sentence and the something you have worried about choice would make me assume that it gives you some sort of advantage against that thing, because no disaster has accompanied the worried, but we'll see if I guess right. Worried about the Red Robe catching us. And the chosen worry will not come to pass during the present enterprise. Alright. Very nice, and the players are aware that they can't do that again since it's been starred. There are a lot of things a thief may want to do aside from casting spells. Their spells will certainly be the most powerful way of dealing with problems. Okay, roll a dice to act. Roll a pool of dice to act, so it's definitely more than 1d6 per player unless you're sharing dice. And then it still wouldn't be 1 per player, probably. Okay. So it's just rolling a pool of dice both ways. It doesn't look like there's a mechanical change between acting and reacting in terms of what you do, though I'm sure there are other rules that interact with acting and reacting versus reacting, rather. And player describes what they're doing, starts with 1d6, makes a case for adding bonus dice, And the GM subtracts die from the pool based on hazard conditions or subtracts hazard dice. I'm guessing that's what that means. Right, rules the pool takes the highest result. So less than 50% chance on each individual dice, but you're in theory using, more than one dice and taking the best one most of the time. Adjectives, specialties, and starred destinies, which I think are things involved in character creations. Difficulty and starred dooms. Starred dooms might be part of character creation, but difficulty sounds more like it's just related to the task at hand. Yeah. Adjectives, specialties, destinies, and dooms. Yeah, so that's all character creation. And the effective spells can do stuff. And I want the place swarming with cops. Yeah, strong moral principle is definitely not a single adjective, I feel like. But, you get some creative license when naming terms, I'm sure. That makes me wonder what would happen if, the person doesn't have any bonuses that apply and it's a hard task. Do you just not remove dice or do they auto fail? Because, you start with one, and if you remove one, then, yeah, that doesn't really work. Neuromancer. Heard of that one, never read it. Finds the word cry. That's very funny because I'm guessing here that cry was a different meaning of the word cry in the original context. But it's changed here. What I find interesting is why the GM in this case decided that no alarm or anything was tripped. I guess it's just because, the word selected was cry, and that wouldn't, trip any of the alarms or anything. If the first word he came up on was alarm or something, things might have gone a lot worse. That's a kind of interesting form of randomization. On page 10, which is actually page 16. No, it's not, no, it's because it's double laid out. Okay, interesting. So Doom and Destiny are potential futures drawn from the book. They don't have an effect until they're starred, which is kind of just like given a check mark, I think. And you star your destiny by pursuing it, whereas you star your doom by failing at reactions. Definitely have to see how destinies are actually made, because there are a lot of dot 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 there's. I feel like that, implies section of the book were used, but there was a lot of space between the sections that we used to make it make sense. But I'll have to see. Maybe like phrases like I will become are actually part of the destiny format itself. Right? I had to step away for a minute again. Read the rest of the page, though. It describes how dooms and destinies get starred, which all seem to make sense. It's interesting that the consequence for a failed reaction, which is sort of like a failed saving throw if you want things in D&D terms, is that one of your dooms gets starred, which may cause you to have more difficulties acting or reacting in the future. Another interesting thing is that a player casts a spell which kind of backfires. From the title, it seems like it may be slowing down or freezing someone, but it turns out that it gives someone sort of a blizzard condition, which makes them difficult for them to see, but gives them the buff of being in bullet time. And ultimately, that causes them to get sort of run over by that person, so that's a way that a spell backfired. What's very interesting, though, is that the GM interprets bullet time as the person the spell is cast on moving at the speed of a bullet, which is very different from the conventional interpretation of bullet time, which is the perceptions of a video game character making everything around them go in slow motion so that they can avoid bullets easier without their physical body speeding up, or in games with more realistic bullet speeds, just have a chance to aim before an opponent fires. Like normally, bullet time, you don't speed up. Your character's movement doesn't speed up, but the aiming reticle, keeps at the same speed even though everything else slows down. Stuff like that. And I don't know if that's intentional. If the point is that the GM misunderstood bullet time, or that's just sort of a coincidence with the author also sort of misunderstanding it. You would think if it was just the GM in this example misunderstanding the intent of the spell, the player would sort of correct them since they're supposed to have a discussion on the effect of the spell, but that's just sort of an interesting thing to note. I'm not sure how much of that was intentional or not. Right, Tonalities, a multiverse of settings. Now that's interesting. From this, it sounds like I was wondering if, the world that the players are acting in is supposed to just be our world with all the books we have, or the world of a tome. And from this, it looks like it may be the world of a tome. Specifically, the one the GM brings, unless the GM ends up collecting someone else's book like all the players do. I'll have to go back and look at that in a second. But I don't know at this point if you're really in the tonality of that book, or that tonality is just influencing a couple of the GM's decisions. Alright, we're asking about the core genre already, so it does look like it is effectively in the world of that book. Yep. It is designed to be able to do that quickly, which is important because that would potentially be a difficult thing, to base a setting off of a book. Yeah, this is an interesting interaction because the player makes a choice that leads to a combination of action and reaction, and another character appears to help them using their adjective, which is a mechanic we haven't been introduced to yet. Oh no, it's CJ's character, Mary. Okay, that makes more sense. Okay, and from this line we get confirmation that if a player is at one die, nothing is subtracted with hazards. It's not an auto failure, for example. Yeah, I would like that in plain text as part of the rules at some point, but it's good that it is in an example somewhere at least. It's interesting because we don't really get into the topic of this until the topic of the section in this example until the very end, where it talks about how the setting is affected by the tome in question. It doesn't directly say that, even, it's just saying that we do know from previous examples that the tome in question is Neuromancer. That, it doesn't say directly how the reality reflects the tome, but it does talk about the reality, and the section talks about how that's based on the tome. It's funny because the GM's book is also used to inspire obstacles, locations, quirks, and powers of the White Guard, so that all could be in the example for this segment, but I'm not really seeing anything that seems to make that the case. There's nothing really about the guards, the obstacles, other than there being guards, you know? It just feels like there could be easy ways to incorporate some of this into the example even as it exists, and that is not fully being done, it feels like, for that example. But I wanted to go back and see how the GM's book works and whether someone else gets their book. I'm guessing not, because they would have to write spells before passing it on, and I don't think it said anything about that, but yeah, it doesn't look like the GM's book gets placed in the center of the table, so they keep their book, which makes sense. I am wondering, though, because this said 2 to 6 players, how any of this really works with 2 players, because one of those players would have to be the GM. Does the GM then write the other player's spells, and, you know, does the GM switch the book in that case? That's something that hopefully will be explained at some point, because I'm not sure how this system would work with 2 players otherwise. Alright, well, on to another section. So I've gone through basically the overview of the way the system plays. It seems fairly well thought out, and I don't have any questions at this point, I feel like. Like, there are some things I don't know yet. I don't really know, uh, like, in the example of play, there's the stealing of the jewel and the escape condition, and those things are separate. And looking back at the table of contents, not the contents, the overview of the game itself, I suppose. Now there's the spell setup phase, the introduction, the character creation, and then the escape. Okay, it begins right after the thieves. Steal the tomes. Okay, so it's the destinies and the escape condition, but whether the stolen jewel is a destiny or whether it relates to the escape condition or what is not fully determined at this point. So I'm definitely interested in the escape condition, whether it's just an escape condition or there's a secondary goal as well, because it really does seem like that was the case from the example of play. So that's one thing I have a question about. Otherwise, how the game plays seems relatively simple. Like, there's the spells, which function in, interesting, semi random, interesting ways that a player is not fully aware of when they cast the spell. You can only use each spell once. I'm not really clear on turn order or whether there's any prerequisites to casting spells and when you can cast them and stuff like that. Like turn order, like I know there's not necessarily a turn order, but it does seem like, when you are about to act, there is a choice between using a spell and, acting normally, and that you can't necessarily just spam actions and spells. And I'm wondering if that's going to be enforced in any way, or if that's just up to players and GM discretion to make sure that doesn't happen. But the way actions and reactions work seem to make sense. They success seems relatively easy because even in the absolute worst circumstances, you've got a 1 in 3 chance of success because the lowest possibility is 1d6, and 1d6 if you roll a, was it a 5 or a 6 or a 4, 5 or a 6? Let me go back because that's very important to remember. Yeah, it's a 5 or a 6, so that's a 1/3 chance. So, like, even in the worst conditions, you have a 1/3 chance of success, which is interesting. That's going to have a huge effect on the system. But the actions and reactions seem to make sense. I don't know much about character creation, but it definitely seems interesting. And, how failure on reactions can lead to increased difficulty based on dooms that can trigger and a character's destiny and how they try to achieve that, helping them later down the line, and them having adjectives, which also help, which is sort of, I guess, things about their character or skills, or that, like, make sense too. So far, I feel like I've got a relatively clear image of the system, and it all seems to make sense. So far, so good. I'm going to not be looking as closely at everything now that we've got a general overview, but there are definitely a lot of details that I need to make sure are nailed down. So moving on to Tomecraft. Alright, I'm back. Alright, so in the beginning, players prepare the spells, the GM prepares obstacles in the world. I want to go back and look at one thing, actually. Yeah, each thief needs to star at least one destiny in order to escape, and once 4 dooms are starred, a thief meets their doom, likely dying, but, they might just be removed from the game in another way. It's entirely up to the player how the thief meets their doom, which is nice. Just wanted to make sure I made note of that, because it's a pretty important set of details. And yeah, so the players make their spells, the DM makes the world and a couple obstacles. An important bit of advice. Okay. Each player will write the first 6 chapter titles of the book. I think this should be earlier. Because the anatomy of a spell section is semi written as instructions. Like, there are a couple lines that indicate it is supposed to be instructional. It should be clear that, it's only going to be 6 chapter titles, and the first 6 specifically. So it says each player will then create an effect, but I thought the choice came first. I guess it sort of makes more sense for, you to think of the effect and then the relevant choice. But let me see how it was written earlier. Yes, so the way this example is written, sure, it has CJ has an idea of what the spell could do, which might be her thinking of the effect and then moving to the choice. But the way it is written, it really looks like she picks the choice and then figures out what the effect is going to be, which is the reverse of how the spell writing process is written later. So it's important to make sure that the order these are written is consistent if you are going to have a specific order for it. Oops, I was trying to see if I was wrong and there was another word other than effect. Like, if, just for an example, if instead of effect this was things a spell will do, and then you go into choices and the effect, but there's a separate thing for the general idea of the spell, then the order would be fine, but this is the thing which is here indicated to be second, which before was indicated to be third. And it's the same term for both, is what I mean. I didn't get anything wrong there. Okay, and here we're getting into how the text of the chapter might actually affect the effect of the spell, and I'm glad that that exists. I don't think it really needs to be earlier because this is where we're really getting into the details of spell creation. I'm just saying that I'm glad that this is here. I think it would be helpful to have a parentheses with the name of the chapter that inspired each of these examples, assuming there is one. That would be more useful as an example, I think, if what the spell name was, because that's mainly what you're drawing from for the effect, was also included. That said, these are all being written as though the choice has already been decided here. Chosen object, chosen person. because like here it says, choices must start with the word choose, and yet the example of effect implies that the choice already exists once you have come up with the effect, even though here it's like you do the choice later. The order is just kind of off, and you don't necessarily need a set order for these things. Like, obviously, before you have a concept of the effect, it's hard to know what you want people to choose about, and before you have a choice involved, you can't really finalize the effect. So one is not directly going to come before the other, but it's sort of been twice where one has been recommended as before the other, and then it was swapped later, so just the way this is described here and earlier might be a little misleading or restrictive. Well, I guess this starts with chosen and this starts with choose. So it's not as bad as I thought. Yeah, and even here, the choice is written before the effect is written. Even though the effect is created before the choice is created. And here we get into something I've sort of thought about before but haven't mentioned of, or at least thought about once we've started sort of, having very specific choices, like specific frogs, it kind of seems like. What if the person, because you start, for casting a spell, you start by just saying the name, because you don't really know what it does, then you're offered by choice. If I said, said the levitating Jamaican, and then they said, the Nazar or GM said, choose chicken cooked by Castro, and I'm like, well, I don't have any of that chicken. What happens then? What happens if you start casting a spell, and then the choice makes it not applicable? Does the spell get wasted? Does a acceptable target suddenly manifest itself? Do you just, the spell fails, but you don't star it or lose the use of it, and now you have more information about how to actually cast it when it is applicable? You know, that's something I would like to have details on at some point. Okay. So this continues until all players have written at least 6 spells. Let me go back. Yeah, there's a lot of inconsistency with how this is written because this says each player will write the first 6 chapter titles of the book. The earlier Anatomy of a Spell section indicates that you would do every chapter, and then the one after that says that, the one I just looked at says everyone does at least 6, but if there's extra time, you can do more. It's sort of just a lot of inconsistency there, and, if it was just there's an earlier version without a lot of detail that is not confusing, but later on more detail is added, that would be fine. But that would only be 2 different versions. We've kind of got 3, and I feel like the first use of it, where it's just, you write each section of a book is a spell, is overly broad and would actually cause confusion of thinking you have to write every a spell for every chapter. So it wouldn't just be a lack of detail; it would be sort of actively misleading in its very first appearance. Like I think this format is a fine way to do things. Of everybody writes 6 spells. Once they have, they say I'm done or whatever, but they can keep writing if they have time, and then maybe choose more spells. I think that's fine as long as it's balanced decently. I'll have to check. It's so inconsistent at this point. I mean, that won't really like if you want people to know, you can just write down the number of spells. Because I'm assuming even if a book has more spells, a player can only cast 6 over a game. But maybe that's not the case, in which case there is a very, big advantage to having a book with more spells in it. I mean, having more to choose from is technically an advantage, but it's not as significant. And this isn't like a very crunchy game or whatever, so I'm not hugely concerned about balance. But if a book does just have more castable spells flatly, that's kind of a bit too much, maybe. Okay, the end of the book sets the escape condition. In your first game, this will require the thieves to steal 2 warding items and get to a sanctuary location. What does that mean? Yeah, I don't really understand that at this point. Why only in the first game, and does that replace the end of the book, or does the end of the book have to play into that somehow? Okay, obstacles are based on chapter titles. And it is good to know about the goal in the world before you go into character creation, so that's nice. So it looks like in the example, you got to the sanctuary location, assuming the market is. Okay, for some reason I thought they were finding those in the market, but it's clear that that's not necessarily the case. Okay. And example spells. Yeah, again, it doesn't really say anything here about there ever being more than 6 spells. And it doesn't look like there's space for it on the sheet, really. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I guess you can sort of fit a 7th in there. Yeah, just for continuity's sake, I know more about why. There was a rocket as well as a gem in the earlier examples of play because you have to have objects that you find. What are they called specifically? You have to find 2 warding items and get to a sanctuary location. That said, I don't know why it's in your first game specifically that happens. Is that just meant to be games in general, but he included the word first for some reason? Just, as sort of filler? Because it definitely more makes it seem like that only applies to the first game. Right, on to character creation, which I might be spending more time on than the tomes because it's one I don't have a lot of details on at this point. Okay, tomes, they take always destined for their hands. Makes sense why that plays into destiny. Oh, that's cool, I guess. And you can modify the name, which is nice. Right, first 2 pages and 3 descriptive phrases or adjectives. I kind of feel like I should follow along for this. Do I have a book anywhere around? I'm not in my room right now, so maybe. This is not my book. It's something on a Kindle, but I've managed to find it. I don't know if I'll be doing this out loud, but I'm going to see if I can figure out how I would do this. Okay, so let's say... Yeah, because if the first 2 pages of your book does not contain any characters, it would be slightly harder, but also more interesting to get descriptive phrases or adjectives. Because some things that describe locations can probably apply to people as well. And there's got to be at least, a location in the first 2 chapters of a book, if not a character, I would think. I mean, it depends on the book. Some can get pretty long-winded about introductions and stuff, but you gotta find descriptions of something in there somewhere, I would think. So let's see. Fascinated with police. That is extremely specific, but I found it here. Quiet, half Italian. So a quiet half Italian who is obsessed with police. I'm not sure half Italian is going to be a very useful adjective, and also may not apply to the setting. Let's say it doesn't apply to the setting, because there's a solid chance that it wouldn't. In say a fantasy world or something. There's going to be some kind of police even in that, but Italians maybe not. Frightfully cross. So, quiet, frightfully cross, and obsessed with police. Which in this case will change to the white guards, because why not? Whatever the white card equivalent is. Let me write those down somewhere, maybe. Yeah, I can't write them down right now. I'll just try to remember it. Okay, write the adjectives in the column of the character sheet. Yeah, quiet, that's easy to apply. Obsessed with police, which would change into white guards. Rules about knowledge for the white guards, there would probably be advantages in. Frightfully cross, what would be a advantage for that? Maybe frightening when angry would be a bit better for that, but frightfully cross can be effectively that anyway, so you could say probably has some form of advantage on intimidating people. So I get how those adjectives that I sort of randomly found in a book could apply. That's a good start. Still not sure about half Italian, but you know. Yeah, and I'd also want to, see about taking all those adjectives and creating an actual character around that, like a backstory, motivation, stuff like that, but I'm gonna wait till they tell me to do that. Now, items that your thief carries, that's never been discussed up to this point, which isn't necessarily a problem, as long as the inventory doesn't hugely feature into the mechanics. It would make sense for it to not come up until character creation, but we'll see. The details of character creation, rather. Yeah, don't have any inherent bonuses, which is part of why they're not, in the abridged version of character creation, I'm assuming. That's kind of cool. I'm not going to bother looking for that, though. Yeah, I'd think if we were doing a shortened version, though, we'd skip inventory too, but that's just me. Yeah, I think the sort of sidebar about Destiny and Doom would be after Destiny and Doom, not before it, but that's just me. Alright, short sentences. Formatted like, when I blank, I will blank. Sorry about that. Okay, I might have to go back and look at the old example of Destiny here. On 24, which is actually 30. It was around here, I think. Okay, yeah. When I have the crown jewel, I will become. So it does follow that format. And that answers my question about, how these are formatted from the book a bit. Right? Yeah, and it doesn't really say where you're supposed to get the destiny phrases from. Whether it's from, the first 2 pages of the book or all about the book generally. For this, I think it could potentially be any part of the book. What's funny, though, is back in the example of, the getting the crown jewel and then getting the rocket to escape, the crown jewel was part of a player's destiny, but also one of the warding objects, probably, which means both Neuromancer and the book that the player character based their character off of, which was a different book, had the phrase crown jewel, which might be a little unrealistic. It might also be an indication that you should try to find, things that fit into the DM's book as well, potentially, or the setting rather, for your destiny, but there's no real guidance on that here. Yeah, this isn't my book, so I don't want to lose the place, so I'm just going to sort of. I'm still using the same pages I used to try and find the conditions. Right, when the police, which I'm using for white cards for this, it has to be when I, so. Could do when I'm upset, but that seems a little weak. Right, the phrase really doesn't involve this at all, but like it involves this, but I'm mangling this phrase horribly. But I'll go with when I run from the police, I will become. An idiot, which is not helpful at all. But they don't really say not to make it unhelpful, so that's the first destiny. When I run from the police, I will become an idiot. I don't know how that's going to be helpful. Which, the destinies are supposed to be once they are starred, but there's not really anything about that here. I know there are definitely ways you could use being an idiot as being helpful. That's just kind of funny. Okay, so it's a random page. That does tell you that, which I think is good. Like, I would not. I would. If you didn't find anything interesting on the first random page, say to flip to another before finishing the destiny, because I think what's interesting should be most important, but I like that this is not necessarily just the first 2 pages, unlike the adjectives. I think that's fine for the adjectives and makes sense that you'll likely find good descriptors for a person or thing from the beginning of a book. But for the Destiny stuff, having random pages is a bit more useful. They also have like negative traits here, so I will become an idiot is not out of place. I would like some guidance on how I will become a glory hog is going to become an advantage, though. I guess you could sort of twist that around to just getting glory in some way, or trying very hard to get glory and therefore being better at it. Doom. So, really, when you think about it, like the second part is just an adjective. So, really, the destinies are all just adjectives that are hidden behind a condition that you have to meet to get that adjective. I need to go back and see if they tell you how many destinies you're writing. Yeah, it doesn't look like it's telling you how many destinies to write, which might be explained later, but does seem like a pretty big oversight. Okay. Writing Doom is a lot simpler. Earlier, Blue Hands was considered to be a Doom, and, you know, situate, and that was in that case Frostbite. And in situations where blue hands were relevant, they'd have a disadvantage. But it seems like a lot of the bad things that happen to you could potentially be a one-time thing that would be hard to apply in later situations. But I'll look at this book and say. Let me see. A doom is a negative descriptor. A phrase or adjective that is negative and describes harm. Right, being half Italian. There we go. Just kidding. It's not particularly harmful. Right, I found the word suspect, and we'll say that the character can become a suspect for the police or the guards or something, or be accused of something, and that can be the doom. Which is not really a full phrase, but. Okay. Electricity and radioactivity, a pike staff. Yeah, a lot of these are very broad. So suspect probably works. Like, if he was trying to hide amongst a crowd of people, he might get picked out easier because he's a known suspect or something. Especially if a wanted poster or something was put out as a result of him being a suspect, and that could be a way the doom could trigger a negative effect when trying to do something. Okay. You should have a good idea by this point of who your character is and what they are good at. That, I don't feel like, is enough about how you're supposed to take all these disparate things and turn it into an actual character concept. So I'm not going to tell you how to write that. I'm just going to sort of go over what that would be like for my character. Right, at this point, my character is a quiet, frightfully cross guy who is fascinated with the police and potentially half Italian. We know he is a criminal of some kind because it seems like, everyone here is a previous competent criminal who decides to steal from the library. It might be better to change that slightly, but because it's a little restrictive, but that is something that I think was written here at one point, not in the character creation section, but so he's quiet, angry, obsessed with the white guards. That's probably part of, his motivation for stealing from them. They wronged him some way in the past, which is why he's angry and focused on them. How I could connect that to the quietness, let's see. He's suffered a lot of tragedy at their hands, and he has trouble connecting with people because of that, so he doesn't talk a lot. For this, I should really come up with the specific thing that they did. Just because I like it, I'm going to say they stole his father's book or something. A book from his father, and his father was injured in the process. And it was a very sentimental thing that his father had, and that upsets him. Stuff like that. The doom is that he becomes a suspect, and that's really easy to work in because, it's the surprising thing is that he's not a suspect already, right? So we'll say that he's been laying low, and that's actually what the quiet is. He's not necessarily talking wise quiet as often, but he's been very careful about not making his, enmity toward the guards known. I'll say that he's actually worked his way up into maybe being faculty at this library in order to prepare for this heist. And I'd also work in details about the setting and the escape method, but I can't really do that without going through all the trouble of using a book to come up with them, and I don't really want to. But, that's sort of how I'd go about turning what we have so far into an actual character, and it doesn't really seem like you talk about a player doing that at all, or have any advice for that, and you probably should. Because every part of character creation so far, there's no real backstory, there's no real personality, it's just a couple of adjectives, really, and that's not quite enough to actually make a character, which I know a lot of players will be decent at on their own, but especially for newer people, it's still good to talk about actually making a character and not just a set of skills. My guy was a guy who was wronged. Like, I still don't really have all the details, but his father owned a bookstore or something. They stole a magic book from him, and he had a heart attack, and as a result, my character has had resentment toward the guards that has colored his whole life and has slowly, quietly been trying to infiltrate their ranks. And his whole life is focused on that, and that's a lot more. It's still not really a full character. I don't even have a name, which I'm not sure you. Well, actually, his name would be the author of the book. I don't know what this book is because it's on a character, but it says Mrs. Marple, so if I'm remembering right, there's a solid chance he is Agatha Christie, which I kind of messed up because, that's not normally a man's name, but whatever. We'll go with Adam Christie. So, there's definitely enough to make a character out of with all the stuff that you do for character creation, but you haven't really talked about actually making a character yet. Maybe that'll be in the example. Okay, description of Library of Nazar. So, yeah, I guess that wouldn't really need to happen before character creation. The world details would, but I would kind of think the library would be a bit part of that because it would be tied to setting, but maybe not. Okay, narration goes clockwise, I guess. Okay, each player describes what their character did and the adjectives they contributed. Yep. Yes, and improv. That's can be a little tough sometimes, but it's fine. Yeah. Okay, there's a specialty here, but it does work as an introduction and let other players know what your thief is good at. It might be good to have an actual introductions to the character too, because there's a lot of details of my character that wouldn't necessarily come up in just a heist. But, that could also come out later through gameplay. Okay, that's cool that the specialty is something you just decide based on what's happened so far, not necessarily just from the book. I like that there are some details that aren't directly tied to the book. My character's specialty, let's see. Infiltration is a strong possibility, but I feel like that's not quite right. That doesn't take advantage of all his adjectives, even if it fits the backstory. Let me try and think. What a good specialty be? I'm just going to go with infiltration because I'm not really creating a character for this. This has just been me trying to work out if everything works, so I'm probably going to move on at this point. We'll just say infiltration. The infiltrator. Okay, spells. Takes a tome. Okay, it does seem like players pick a book based on what they want for their character. I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be like that or more random, so it's good to have some clarification. Okay, name, yeah. Okay, and she's picking a pilot because it's Mars based, I'm guessing. Okay, picks the adjective. Yeah. And so you could see how you could construct a backstory from all these adjectives and her basic concept of wanting a scroungy pilot, but there is no mention of her actually doing that, which I think is important to have. I'd prefer it in like full text, but it's fine for an example. It's just this example doesn't even really have that. It just has, what's here being done. Like there's a little more details in that the pilot doesn't come directly from the book or the adjectives or anything. It's just sort of a character concept, but it's still not really a full concept or a backstory or a personality. Just elements of those without really working at connecting them. Okay, there we go. We're still going for it. Okay. Okay. She wants the character to steal some sort of getaway vehicle for the game. That's an interesting detail. And that's like you can definitely see how all these elements are adding richness to the character, but they're still not creating a personality or tying everything together yet. It's still just a lot of details that aren't necessarily part of a bigger thing yet. Yep. Wants to go to space, pregnant. Yeah, given that that's a doom, it would probably have to be the fourth doom, because once the fourth one triggers is when they die. Fecal popcorning. Don't know what that one is, but it does not sound pleasant. Some of these would probably be hard to tie to a failed reaction, and since it seems like every failed reaction you get a doom starred, that you might want to try to make them a little more general than they are here. Okay. Fits into the narrative in the heist and specialties. I feel like that wasn't really explained there, but I feel like there's no real actual writing of a character, just listing of details, which I think is, the actual making a description of a character in full is an important part of pretty much any character creation process, I think. And that's not included in the rules or the example, but, it could work without it. That's just not how things are typically done. Like, there's no space for a backstory here, there's no space for a brief description of a character. It's a bunch of details, but there's nothing on here that's supposed to tie them together. I don't know what recast or tome boost is. I suppose I will learn later. Like, I'm skimming right now, so I'm not going to read all of these, though it does seem like I could learn something from some of those. Okay. Summary of character creation phase. That's kind of confusing. If you're not creating Doom, how could it even be starred? But that's for light games. I don't really care about the specialized rules for light games that much at this point. Okay. Yeah, we're on to another section now, which is good because I'm getting a bit tired. Each star, one destiny, meet the escape condition. Okay, palette of obstacles, locations, and actions. It's interesting that the players are planning out how to reach their destinies out of character so overtly. I would have expected them to happen a little more naturally. Yeah, I need to go back to the character sheet because I need to see how many destinies there are. Okay, so it looks like, even though it was, like I said, not specifically stated, yeah, there's supposed to be 4 dooms, but there's a dotted line for one of them for some reason. The 4th one is potentially the one that kills you, I guess, so maybe it has something to do with that, but it looks like there are 3 destinies. Three stars, learn your spell sheet. I don't know what that means. But it looks like the 3 destinies, like I said, which should have been written in the destiny section, I feel like, but because like stuff like this, it is a little weird how you would justify the player characters trying to achieve the player's destinies, or rather, it's not clear if the player characters probably don't know their destinies. So it's kind of going to be awkward if you're actively trying to seek them out some of the time. In this example, it works out because things match up, but yep. Yeah, so each player must star one destiny for everyone to escape, except players that are removed from the game. That's something you can figure out, obviously, but it's not explicitly stated. I don't know if it needs to be. Um, it's also because I was thinking earlier that potentially you could have some characters that star their destinies and some that don't, and thereby have some managing to escape that way and others not. Sort of have an alternative way of characters failing or have a semi good ending, but it doesn't look like there's any setup for that in the current version. players escaping is either all or nothing unless they specifically get doomed 4 times. Alright, casting spells. Yeah, no turns in this game. But the DM can say a spell cannot be used at a certain moment. GM can say a spell cannot be cast at a certain movement. And I'm assuming that goes for actions as well. That's not surprising. This doesn't seem to be a game that would need a more rigid turn order. I feel like things could kind of get chaotic in a bad way sometimes, but I'd have to actually play to know. Okay, must open their tome to the first page of a chapter and read the spell name. I don't really know why they have to open their tome, but I guess it's nice for dramatic effect. Right, this so far is all stuff we've seen before. Okay, if it is not possible to make a choice at the moment, I'm glad this is here. The spell fails, but can be tried again later. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. That's one of the options I thought it might be. Yeah, here in effect. And they discuss what the effect is going to happen. Uh-huh. It's interesting to note that the spell is specifically consumed this way. Like, I know you couldn't cast it again, but I wasn't sure the in-universe explanation was some sort of consumption. Skin. Huh. Well, that's a very strange spell. Okay. Yeah, I can't think how getting smaller and on that person's skin would actually be helpful for getting around the fog, unfortunately. Um, if there was a person that was immune to the fog, then they could all get on his skin and get through it that way, potentially. But what I'm really curious about is whether. So it seems like it was a bad time to use the spell, unfortunately, though the player had no way of knowing that. What I'm curious about is how long does this last? How is that determined? 5, the consequences. Alright. Like, for this example, I think you really need to figure out, like, state how that could ever be reversed. Because this seems like that would make, like, supposing this does not, end the game. In theory, the game only fails by all players failing reactions 4 times, but that in itself might be an oversight because it seems like this, unless the spell is reversed, pretty much makes it extremely difficult to actually get a victory. But since the failure condition will also be relatively limited from this potentially, it would just extend the game. The other thing is, even if you get creative about it and find ways to succeed despite the rest of the party being shrunken on someone's skin, it seems like that would make the game potentially a lot more boring for the shrunken players because it makes it harder for them to engage with a lot of the goals and the solutions to the escape. That said, this is all assuming that this spell does not wear off after a certain amount of time, and I kind of have to assume that because there's no mention of that in the example. And if spells like this are common, spells that have a incredibly massive effect on how everything's going to work out, there might need to be some kind of universal rule for either reversal or a set length of time that any spell can be in effect. In game time. There may be something like that later on, and I just haven't encountered it yet, though. They must add this descriptor to their dooms, so they get another doom and they star it, and that also effectively takes away their health. Okay, and the player only starts with 3 unstarred dooms. But that means the game can never be lost unless players recast spells. So that's probably a bad rule, I'm going to be honest. I mean, I guess you could say that once you run out of the 6 spells, that the win condition is likely impossible. So that's also kind of a limiting factor that might force someone to recast a spell, but I just think this doesn't really work. A character should be able to lose or die unless you want the game to be super positive without specifically having to recast a spell in order to do so. GM hands the spell sheet. Okay, so they know the spells. It also happens after every player has cast every spell at least once, which would make sense because they know all the spells now. Looking at destinies again, when I perform the first part of my journey on horseback, I will become elemental. Those two don't really connect to each other, I guess, and it's hard to explain how that would happen, in story. I'm gonna have to go back to look at the old destinies to see if that's a bit contradictory or not, or if it's always potentially hard to explain. What were the destinies? Okay. When I lead the way in proud silence, I will become a glory hog. That's easy to understand how those connect. Hypnotic power, I will become clairvoyant. Easy to understand how those connect. When I had better leave, I will become destructive. Sure. When I drive in a blue Buick, I will become the impossible. That's one that's like, it would be difficult to figure out how to really make that happen. Like the character spirits away in a blue Buick, and then they are impossible, so you can apply that to adjectives. The hard part is in when describing the events that are happening, how you connect driving away in a blue Buick. I guess it's spirit away, so that might help, to becoming impossible. So it seems very easy to construct destinies that are a little annoying to actually fulfill in a way that makes sense, or rather get the effect of in a way that makes sense after they're fulfilled. I don't really have anything to say about that. I don't know if it would be worth it to try and stop that, or it would just be fun to have to get creative. I'm just noting that this could be a potential annoyance in a session. Not really any more thoughts on that. Like, here's another one. If you are just turning someone down in a completely separate situation, how do you become a crime kingpin? I guess I will have to look at fulfilling destinies and see if you're supposed to take the second thing into account to see whether it gets fulfilled or not. these are supposed to be important, pivotal moments in your character's life, so I guess it would, be a good idea to take both sides of the phrase into account and only count the destiny as fulfilled if both things would make sense to occur in that situation, at least some of the time. I don't know if there's anything written about that in the rules, though. I don't really feel like going all the way back to each time destinies are talked about to see if there are specifications on when to consider them fulfilled or not, though. So, I'm just mentioning that's something that maybe should be there, and if it already is and I've missed it, oh well. Yeah, and like the solution to getting back to normal size in this case is someone mastering a tome and happening to have a spell that would work for that, which it seems to be a relatively rare circumstance. It still seems like the whole shrinking spell would be pretty debilitating to just, success and also fun generally, potentially. Like in a campaign where the entire goal could change based on just surviving the skin desert, that would be a fine thing to happen, but in this kind of system where there's a very set goal, an effect like this being possible without reversal being, you know, easily available, or something else chaotic happening that would make reversal unnecessary being easily available, uh, does kind of, I feel like, not work very well. But we'll have to see if there is another way that spells get reversed that I just haven't seen yet. Okay, acting. I guess they haven't talked about failure yet. The GM will introduce a complication, which I don't know, but I'm guessing will come in the form, or potentially come in the form, of something the players will have to react to, upon which failing, they get the actual definitive consequence, which is the starred doom. Or at least the mechanical consequence. There might be narrative consequences that have an effect on mechanics later down the line. Okay, Thieves Axe. Start 1d6. I'm glad this was clarified because it would be very confusing otherwise. Each ally can contribute a single bonus die if their thief is helping with the action and they have an appropriate source. That's interesting, but with no restrictions on helping other than the appropriate source. Honestly, that's probably going to get annoying after a while, because every player is going to try to contribute every single time because there's no real restrictions on it. Okay, yeah, you can remove multiple for difficulty. That definitely makes sense, but I hadn't really thought about it in detail before. This could get kind of chancy, but overall it's fine. Okay, complication, we might get more detail on that soon, because it's highlighted, and I haven't really seen the word complication very often. Okay, flips around the page of the book. Would, I think I've already seen this. Yeah, this was the cry thing. Okay. Right? In a way that prevents them from acting in the same way again is a good bit of advice. Okay. Right. Make a new problem or force the player to try something different. Yeah, sort of already gone over that. I think I'm going to skip this example because I don't have that much energy at this point. Okay, let's see how many pages are left in this. Not too many. Okay, reacting. This is important to look over. Okay, when consequences are threatened, any thief can react. That seems different than what I've heard before. In all the previous examples, it seemed like the DM was having a threat act on a specific player and then telling them to react. That's what I've seen so far in the examples, and that sort of makes more sense to me than this. But this might just refer to things that are more like obstacles that you have to react to. I think there should be a bit of distinction there, and there might be. We'll have to see. Okay. Anytime something is about to happen, a player can react with a pool of dice. I think that is cool. I think you should set it up so players can't, all react to the same thing in order. Like, you know what I'm saying? It should be one reaction per problem, I feel like. So you don't have all players dogpiling on. And that wouldn't really be a problem consequence wise, because, if they all fail, they all get consequences. It would just kind of be annoying, I think. Okay, threatened thief and reacting thief are potentially separate. Okay. Like, I don't really know that I love how this system works exactly. I feel like so far it seemed like the starring of a doom is always worse than a consequence, especially since the starring of a doom is the only thing that can lead to death, as far as I know. So, using reactions to stop consequences seems like something that a player would not want to do as often, but that's just me. And I don't really like how danger can apply to one thief, but any other thief can try to circumvent it no matter what. Like, I feel like this is just maybe a little wishy-washy and stuff like that, but it's not terrible or anything. Yep. Yeah, so the GM is looking at their dooms, and then they start the doom and narrate the harm, which is interesting because that means the GM is interacting with your sheet, which isn't a problem. It's just sometimes a rarity, so I feel like noting that that is something that can happen in this system. Okay, so like here it's already inconsistent because there should be a consequence and a doom starred, but this it seems like the consequence and the doom being starred are not separate things here, and it's hard to tell what would have happened if the thief just let if the thief just let the sword strike him, because the same thing would happen in theory, but there would be no doom from it because he hadn't failed. Yeah, I guess like the consequence here is that the arm doesn't work anymore and he gets the doom, whereas otherwise the arm just wouldn't work anymore. But there also isn't really a category for, like, maybe that folds into difficulty, but if it's not a doom, then ultimately it won't subtract from his actions, so it kind of doesn't matter whether the arm is gone or not unless it's a doom. And spell reactions, that's new. So the question is here, though, like, if the spell does not stop the consequence still happens. That's obvious. The question is, does the player also get a doom as they would for failing a roll or not? Because that is not established here. Yeah, so it looks like the destiny is very much based on the condition part of the statement, which I feel like is a mistake when sometimes the condition and the descriptor are very, very at odds or just not connected. In those cases, it might be better to, especially if the condition is something very obvious like falling, it might be important to take the descriptor into account to whether it is fulfilled. And like obviously it's pending GM approval, but some actual guidance on involving the descriptor might be nice. Like destinies cannot be achieved by artificially forcing them to occur, and yet from the beginning, earlier it stated that players are supposed to actively pursue destinies out of character. So that seems at odds. Okay, tempo. I'm gonna have to go back a bit too, because I want to make sure I don't remember what it was, but I want to actively highlight the portion I think conflicts there. Okay, I think it would be in the escape. Yeah, the thieves' goals probably. And that is 33, though it won't directly be 33 on this. It'll be relatively close, maybe 5 off, like 38 or something. Never mind, definitely further than 38. No, it was 38. Well, I got that right. Okay. Because this very much seems like trying to artificially force a destiny, right? Like, and I get that it aligns with the escape condition, but he's immediately like, okay, let's actively try to get our destinies going. And, it says use the forge, so I'm going to go seek out a forge. That does seem pretty artificial, just based on how I see things. There are no turns or initiative in this game. Pacing. Tempo. Okay. This seems like it's something that's going to be vastly important, yet only has a small section dedicated for it. Like, this would be huge, but I'm not seeing, like, it's not being introduced till late, and it's super small. Player actions and spells. Reactions. What? I don't get it. What? So I guess because it's not the players versus the enemies or the outcome, it's the consequence to the actions or the spells. But if it's consequences, it should not be actions, it should be exclusively reactions, right? And what is the one, like, what is this, what is the first column and what is the second column? For now, let's just assume the first column is the number of consequences and the second is the number of actions that players get in response, though it would be reactions or spells, not actions. Okay, so nothing is actively threatening the thieves. Then it should be 0, 0, because it's the number of actions or spells as opposed to consequences. And if there are no consequences, there, which it would have to be if there is no active threat, then there cannot be any actions or spells in relation to that consequence because there is no consequence. Like, this needs to be reworked because I can't even understand what it's supposed to represent. And you're introducing it way too late if you're going to have a system like this. At this point, I think you can play the game without this entirely, but it's not up. It's not. And I know I've said things about how, like, I'm not sure how you would, figure out how many actions would apply to a certain situation in certain circumstances, but that's not necessarily a problem. That's just a way of designing a system where it ends up being up to GMs and players to decide that sort of thing. If you are doing a system where there's a specific thing like this, it needs to be integral and, like, really emphasized from the beginning. You can't add it in at the end. And the way it's written, I genuinely just don't get it. Like, so outnumbering, I'm guessing that's 2 consequences to 1 reaction, but that might mean you can't react to every consequence, which is at odds with earlier descriptions. Okay, and now, so it is enemies having more actions, not consequences. This is just not properly described. Give me a second, I'm trying to remember what all my sort of main issue areas have been at this point. Alright, I had to stop to write down my thoughts a bit just to make sure I didn't forget things. Okay, moving on. Tome bursts. Yeah, this is another thing that is coming up way too late. Huh, okay. If any time player rolls lower than or equal to the current doom on the die, they get a random positive bonus based on their book. Like, that's really strange. Because death is already very hard to achieve. Like, you have to specifically choose to reroll in order to do that. Yeah, and then get that 4th doom actually starred. And the more dooms you have, the better off your character is in some ways. Like, don't really know why this is here to just counteract the effect of dooms having negative effects. Like, the doom is still the effect of having multiple dooms is still probably overall worse because that can change a success into a failure uh, by taking or possible success into a failure by giving you less chances at rolls, but um, the tome boost sort of mitigates that. I mean, I guess it's kind of cool to have a random effect thing here, but um, you know, it's kind of weird that it only comes into play if you're doing poorly, and like I said, it's very late. Like, this might be fine. It's one of those things where I'd have to play to know, but it seems like it can happen a little too often. Like, once you have two dooms, anytime. Oh, yeah, on any die, that's gonna trigger so often. Like, once you have three doom and you roll two die, one or two, either die getting a one or two, that's like more than a third chance on every roll that you get a tome burst. So that's pretty likely to happen, and it's kind of random and always positive. It's just, that's a lot. This probably is not very balanced. And like random things that do cool, weird effects, I feel like should be really random, and this seems like it would happen too often. Like, I just don't really get this, but it's like tempo, I do not understand at all, and it needs to be earlier because like that changes the game entirely. This, it's just kind of neat. So, wait, why does it say lowest die if on any die? I don't. Okay, I also don't understand this one. So, yeah, Tempest and Tome Boost seem very weird. This one might be fine. Tempo definitely needs to be reworked. But this is just kind of surprising. And we're pretty much at the end, luckily, because I'm pretty tired at this point. Yeah, and the obstacles, for example, aren't really included on the demo. A lot of the stuff that the DM would do is not included, but I feel like you have enough that you can basically play the game, which is nice. I'm going to come back and record some of my overall thoughts a little bit later, but I need to take a break for now. Alright, having looked through the demo pretty much completely at this point, it's all very good. It's probably one of the best books we've had submitted so far. You know, a lot of these projects are experimental or from, you know, relatively amateur creators, so a lot of flaws begin to, even to promising projects, a lot of flaws begin to seep in as you continue reading the book. But that didn't really happen here until I got to Tempo, which I think is the first thing that's kind of like just doesn't make sense. Where is that? And that's pretty common for the stuff at the end of a book to just kind of be a lot worse, at least the kind of projects that we get submitted normally. Like, I really like how interesting and creative the system is, and everything seems like it will just make sense and come together for the most part. That said, I do have some more major complaints along with a lot of the minor ones I've said before. And that's sort of kind of everything to do with the win condition, I think, is a little awkward. First of all, it's hard to say what, like, when exactly a destiny is fulfilled. And whether you're supposed to actively pursue them or not. And this is more of a personal thing, but I would like it For some people, for the mission to be completed with some people not filling their destiny, it's just those players don't manage to escape. I think that adds a lot of intrigue to it and also helps with some of the stuff around the failure conditions, which I think have issues because death is, something that only happens once you get 4 dooms, and that's pretty rare because in order to get 4 dooms, you have to specifically choose to recast a spell, which you probably don't need to do. It also makes consequences confusing because, the word consequences is used a couple times, but it's not really fully defined, and it seems like if we're just going with a character dies or gets removed from the game once they get 4 dooms, and consequences are not things that give you dooms, it kind of seems like the consequences don't have as much teeth as they could. They're just stuff that potentially gets in the way of completing your goal, but doesn't actually stop you from completing the goal because it doesn't cancel out destinies or, uh, prevent you from reaching the sanctuary definitively because you're not out of the game unless you get those 4 dooms. And similarly to that, spells can have long lasting major permanent effects like shrinking all of the party except one person, but not actually contribute to doom or death or getting knocked out of the game at all either. And all of those put together really contribute, I think, to the issue that potentially everything that happens in the game doesn't contribute to you really losing the game. It just makes it last longer and longer and longer because the win condition keeps getting harder to fulfill. Or maybe isn't even really a problem at all because stuff like spell boosts, getting up to 3 dooms just provides you with potential advantages, especially because you can't get that 4th one unless specifically choose to recast a spell. So, I think a lot of the issues that might pop up here are around the win conditions and consequences versus dooms and, stuff like that. And how spells can sort of really get in your way with no hope of overturning them. There's just a lot of stuff that I feel like can extend the game massively without actually increasing chances of failure significantly. I also don't really love how, it's a minor dialogue thing, but it says in your first game that you have to get 2 warding objects and a sanctuary location. And that's just super confusing because, especially with it talking about the escape um, condition being related to the book, it makes it difficult to determine whether every game is supposed to have those, and that's a really important element to establish. So I just feel like some of the details around the win condition and failure conditions can use some work. And I don't really think you need tempo. Some guidance around when players can act would be nice, but tacking on a system for it at the end is just too little too late to actually make it a hard rule or a hard pseudo initiative. And if that's not what you're going for anyway, it shouldn't really be in there. Just a couple things once one person fails a reaction for a consequence, not everyone can subsequently pile on like that would be more than sufficient to make sure things don't get too bloated. Yeah, so those are pretty much my thoughts. Like I said, I think it's a really good game. It has a very interesting concept and a lot of familiar ground for TTRPG, which would make it easy to pick up, while also not having the major flaws that I typically expect in more experimental systems. So, yeah, I definitely am looking forward to see where this goes.